Hey everyone! Today we are going to be talking about how species changed. We know that ecosystems can change, but sometimes the species or the organisms in an ecosystem can also change. There's something called DNA that you might have heard of. This is essentially what makes up who we are. We inherit DNA from our parents. So every organism inherits traits from their parents, which means that everybody looks a little bit different. You know how a lot of people might say you look like your mom or your dad, or maybe you look like both of them? That's the same for animals too. Everyone says that I look a lot like my dad and that my brother says I look a lot like my mom, but we both have characteristics or features from both of our parents, and this is because we inherited DNA from them. So for example, if we take a wolf, we know that if we look at a wolf, we can tell if it's a wolf because they have the same general characteristics. For example, all wolves have the same number of eyes and legs. However, every wolf is just a little bit different because they have different parents, which means they might be different heights. Their fur might be different colors. As the species continues to reproduce, wolves will continue to look a little bit different, so they evolve over time. DNA is the traits that are inherited, but there are some traits that are not inherited. DNA isn't the only thing that affects how an animal might change. The ecosystem affects it as well. Organisms can't grow without the proper amount of food, water, sunshine, shelter, and animals won't grow well if there aren't enough resources or proper weather conditions for them. So the ecosystem can actually affect the color of an organism. Did you know that flamingos are not naturally pink? They're actually naturally white, but when they live in an environment where shrimp is what they eat, they turn pink. Hydrangeas are a type of flower and its color depends on the soil. So you'll see in this picture here, some of them are red, some of them are blue, and some of them are somewhere in between. Then there's something called adaptations. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about ecosystems. So sometimes a mutation can occur in an organism's DNA, which means that something changes in their genes, not the kind of genes you wear, but the genes that are in your chemical makeup. Mutations can be harmful or they can be helpful. A mutation might cause an animal not to reproduce the type of blood cells that fight off germs, and this can lead to making them very sick. So that would be a harmful mutation. However, a helpful mutation might help an animal adapt to its environment. So for example, if an environment suddenly becomes colder than a bird is used to, their genes might mutate to produce more feathers, and that way the bird stays warm. There are two different types of adaptations. The first is a structural adaptation. This is when body parts change so that the organism can survive in its ecosystem. For example, if one hummingbird was born with a longer beak than another hummingbird, it has a better chance at getting food from flowers than other birds. If you look at the picture, you'll see its long beak. This is what goes through the flower to get to the food. Now, obviously, if it has a longer beak, it has a better chance of getting more food. So think about it this way. My husband is a foot taller than me, which means that he's a lot more likely to shoot a basket than I am. So if we're playing basketball together, he has the advantage because he has a structural adaptation. He is taller than me. He is more likely to win the game. The second type of adaptation is a behavioral adaptation. So this is when you inherit behaviors that help animals survive. So it doesn't affect your body, it affects the way that you act. An organism called a musk oxen. This animal has adapted to form circles around their babies, which protects them when there are predators around. If you look at the picture, you'll see how effective that is. There's a small type of rodent called a lemming that have adapted to migrate to a new area if their population gets too large. That way they don't have to compete for resources like food, water, and shelter. An example to put into real life terms is when my husband and I moved here, I had to adapt behaviorally. I used to be able to walk down the street and see my friends back in my old home, but when we moved, I had to learn to stay in contact with them through calling, texting, and FaceTiming. We've all experienced a behavioral adaptation this year with the coronavirus. We had to learn how to do school from home. It's not the same, but we had to adapt in order to do well, right? All right, so that's all we're going to be talking about today. You can go ahead and fill out your Google form.